Week. Woo! Our mission with this conference is simple: to bring together the entire startup community across every industry department and funding stage. Startup Boston exists to connect, educate, and celebrate this ecosystem while serving as a trusted, unbiased guide to the best resources that can help you start and scale your startup or your team. My name is Kai. I'll be your host for today. But before we kick things off, I do want to say a huge thank you to Suffolk University for hosting this conference. They've been hosting us for the past 3 years, and for that we are very grateful. If you're interested in exploring entrepreneurship, they offer a great variety of programs and opportunities. If you're interested in checking those out, you can go up to the 5th floor where they have their own little table. You can also talk to them to offer not only how they can support you on your own startup journey, but also how you can support their own community of entrepreneurial students. Otherwise, we have a wonderful panel for you here today with a lovely panelists. One thing I will ask is that they're going to have their time to talk, and of course, you're going to have a whole bunch of questions, I am sure. We will have a Q&A section toward the end, and for this, please hold your questions to then, in which case we'll ask you to raise your hand so we can come up and give you a mic and you can have your little diva moment. But otherwise, thank you so much again for attending Startup Boston Week, and now on to the session.
Hello, my name is Nathan Johnson. I'll be moderating this panel. I'm from Vern Bio. We do cannabis biotech. My former life was in doing pharma and data science, doing a lot of science and life science data analysis and data research. I want to first introduce kind of the overview of what this event was going to be focused on. Then we'll introduce each of the panelists for a few seconds, and then we'll go over a few broad questions. And then, as mentioned, the last 15 minutes will be focused on Q&A. So first things first, modern life sciences doesn't rely on just lab equipment. It uses a lot of data that is progressively getting more and more complicated, more enriched. Next generation sequencing was the big one of that, but it's getting more and more complicated as language models and so on and so forth comes involved. This panel brings together technical leaders as well as different groups building scientific applications at scale, because it's not only about the complexity of data, but also how do you get that data fast in the right manner, but also handling the complexity of compliance. And so going into this panel, I'll go from left to right. We try to sit them in order of their picture. That was on purpose. And just very briefly, each of the panelists to say where you're from, what you're doing, kind of how this application fits your role, and then we'll go into the questions.
I'll start.
So, thank you.
Hi, my name is Piali. I am the founder and CEO of Ashmi Health. I live in Boston. So what we do is we help pregnant women find the right nutrition during their pregnancies, and we are focusing mostly on high-risk pregnancies where there is still a significant amount of maternal mortality involved. So we help reduce risk, and we help them provide lifestyle intervention, and we use a lot of AI in all our applications. So today I believe I would speak about talking about the consumer experience and how can we design AI to fulfill those particular consumer needs, especially when it's a vulnerable community or especially when it's at a vulnerable phase like pregnancy. Thank you.
All right. My name is Pradeep Bokinala. I am a Chief Technology Officer at Simbex from Lebanon, New Hampshire. And what Simbex does is a product development company in wearables as well as medical device development. And my expertise is in software, especially scaling the software applications. That includes not only just the software, but behind the scenes, AI and data science and algorithms.
Hi, I'm Jane Allard. I've been in the software space for a long time. Previous to my role at GSK, I was CTO at a startup, and we were making a large data platform. And now at GSK, I'm also working on our internal large data platform, which is called Onyx. We're trying to bring in all the research data we have available for our machine learning scientists to accelerate drug discovery. And my focus there is on the governance side. So being in a pharma industry, there's like a lot of regulations. So we're working on how do we use automation and different kinds of tools so that we can do governance at scale, so that we can enable our scientific users not to be burdened by that, but also to meet all of our compliance obligations. So I think that's the focus I'll be talking about, the governance side.
Hi, my name is Ashley Connard. I would argue that my interest in research is really to try and develop AI machine learning methods to allow for people to age healthily and then die suddenly and peacefully. So the idea that this idea is interesting, right? You could imagine living your whole life in a healthy way, and then you're just not on this earth anymore. And so the way that I do this actionably is as a senior researcher at Microsoft Research within a group called Health Futures, where we focus on enabling healthier futures for each individual. And specifically, we've been partnering with the Broad in two areas. One is in more effective rare disease diagnosis and reducing latency to that diagnosis. And then thinking about how, in the context of drug discovery, do we think about improving cancer therapeutics and also a couple other areas of drug discovery.
Well, thank you, everybody. So diving into our questions. First things first, how do we architect all this biology complexity? So previously to this, I had asked all the different speakers to kind of sign up for which talks were more relevant to their experience. And then we'll kind of, that way we'll just kind of streamline just because everybody's experience is a little bit adjusted. So Jane and Ashley, would you mind answering this question? How do you approach designing systems that can handle messy, high-dimensional biological data without sacrificing performance or scalability? The big question.
Yeah, it's a big question. I think in some ways it depends how much money you have, what choices you're going to make on what you're looking at. So I think it's, to start is you want to make a plan of looking at like what kind of data you're looking at. Do you have an idea of the different types of data? Do you have the scale of it, like how large it's going to be? And then you want to look at solutions on the market that are going to support that. And like in some ways goes down to budget, like what you're willing to pay for. Like will you give up a little bit of latency because you don't have to get as big of machines. So you have to really plan out for what it's going to look like based on the size and type of your data. And because it is messy, you're going to be looking at a lot of unstructured data, which means that you're also then going to have to spend time on figuring out how to understand it and structure it. So when I think about this problem, like what amount of effort and energy are you spending on how you're storing and manipulating the data, and then in terms of almost like developers or algorithms or what you could even use with AI to then get that data in a form that you can use. So you have to think about those requirements that you have for your system. And this is a space that's changing all the time. There's new tools available all the time. You kind of go see what's out there, like what are people using, do some research about what's available. I mean, there's like the standard cloud native platforms. If you're a startup, there's a lot of often deals you can get as a startup on some of those platforms, like AWS and Google. So that's always a place to try first if you have those capabilities.
At the end, we have 15 minutes Q&A.
I'll add to that when we talk about messy data, there's a question of like, why is it messy and where did it come from? And at least in my work, we realize now more and more that this issue of garbage in, garbage out is real. And even if you had one really nice structure to say have a dual assay, right? You have a cell, you pull out single cell RNA and an image. Like that's a hard problem because you have to kill the cell. So if you wanted to do this for many cells, or if you wanted to do this in two labs, you're going to have a lot of types of batch effects. So being really sure that you're aware of the assumptions you've made when you've set up your wet lab experiments, but also really thinking about, from the method standpoint, architecting it in such a way that you can overcome some of those assumptions such that you can remove those batch effects is a really good way of making sure that you're handling the messiness instead of pulling it out as a feature.
Yeah, to add on that point, like if you're in control of the source, then you can do more to try to remove potential messiness. But if you're not, you have to assume you're going to have to clean your data, and that is going to be something you're going to have to do. And there's tools that can help you do it, or you can, if you have the skills yourself, you could do it, or you have to hire people. You're going to do it. But like you're talking about, it is messy, and you're going to have to spend time on that if you're going to have useful data for your task.
And I would argue it's the most important thing you could do, right? Like at least as a computational biologist who works a lot with computer scientists, mathematicians, physicists, people in HCI, human-computer interaction, who are really working with, at this interface of trying to figure out, okay, we build something, who's it useful for? How is it useful? How do we measure it's useful? Like knowing about the data and how it's collected is an essential skill that I think is becoming more and more paramount as we're building more and more complex methods.
I think in this space as well, there's less maturity in the tools available for cleaning. Like there's a lot of messy data out there, and if it's kind of standard data around, names, birthdays, addresses, like there's tools that'll help you clean that up. But in the biology space, it's so wide and variant about what it could look like, and it's also not as mature in the tools that you can get off the shelf. So that's a space that you definitely have to think about how you're going to do that, and if you have to bring that in-house, or if you're going to try to find something or maybe even someone that will partner with you on that. Because I think there's other startups in this space that are working on it that I've talked with.
Thank you both. Going into kind of the next step from your data in terms of actually using the data. So usability failures and fixes. What are some common usability mistakes when designing tools for scientists, clinicians, or even non-clinicians or scientists in the case of pregnancy in women? So I'll start with Piali. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Sorry.
So I think for us, at least, a lot of it is very user dependent. We are really dependent on user finding the time to enter their data, user finding the time to use our app. So everything has to be designed considering that particular person. So whatever we do, we think of the end user, their day-to-day, what fits into their schedule. So for us, a lot of it is the UX and UI of it. How do you make it as easy as possible? How do we engage users similar to something like a TikTok or Instagram would do, where users don't feel compelled to do it medically, but they feel a kind of joy when they're using the product. So then it comes to restrictions around what kind of data we get. We do not get completely clean data. We do not get completely structured data. But for us, it's acceptable because ultimately, because we are so dependent on users, so we have to spend extra time on cleaning up the data, making it structured.
You can keep going down the line. Yep. Whoever has another thought on this? Jane or Ashley? Yeah.
I might
for it.
just add that, again, it comes down to thinking about how whatever you're building is going to end up being used. I feel that when we've worked with partners, one of the massive assets that they bring is not only expertise of a joint investigation of the right problem to solve, but then when you construct the solution, how does it need to be presented to the end user? And so through things like user studies, you can not only identify the right problem to be solving, but then you bring that all the way through to engaging with them in a structured user study over time to assess where they click, what they think about the experience, and having a reasonable set of diverse participants at that stage is crucial to being able to get it right, such that it is not only maintained by whoever you're building it for, but can be used day in and day out.
I can add a little bit to that when you talk of structured user studies. So we are a startup. We don't have a lot of resources or time. So we didn't have time to do really structured conventional user studies, but we did a lot of user interviews, like following their day-to-day, actually seeing what happens when they wake up in the morning to the time they go to bed. So for our users, they do like glucose measurements 4 times a day. So tracking that and looking at what pain points they encounter in the day-to-day, and sometimes just working as a consultant nutritionist with them to like get direct input of their pain points have helped us understand more of the user information. There you go ahead.
I just wanted to echo what Ashley was saying is you got to know to whom you're building. You have to understand what are the insights that they're looking. Right now, data is very much available anywhere you go, but how do you bring the insights in a meaningful way is the key thing. And it could be a picture, or it could be another way of displaying in a text. It does not matter. But if the user is not connecting with your application that you're writing, or even in the clinical studies, clinicians who are looking at your data, if you are not properly explaining what data you're showing, it's a loss. And you built a lot of good applications and collected a lot of data, but then you're not able to explain it in a way that your end user, including your investor, right? If they're not connecting with you, it is going to be a loss. And that is the most important thing that I wanted to emphasize on this UI or UX side is know your user, to whom you're building, and make sure that you bring in the right way that information.
Excellent. So moving on to validation in a high-stakes environment, I'll go back to you, Pradeep, as well as Ashley and Jane, if you have input. When software could impact clinical decisions, regulatory filings, or patient outcomes, and you all have some sort of overlap to that, how do you handle that validation in such a high-stakes environment, especially when data is messy, data may not correlate directly, or it may come from something like an LLM and ChatGPT? How do you handle all that complexity
Yeah.
in terms of the validation? You're good.
When you look at validation, right, what are you trying to do? One thing is like, hey, my product is doing what it is supposed to. Right? You can always say, I'm testing it well. But to me, validation is more than just testing. It is building trust. To whomever you're serving, you're building trust to say, my product that I'm giving it to you is going to perform in the way that I have described. That is the key thing when it comes to validation. And in the high stakes environment, validation means a lot of different things, especially in the regulatory environments. What you wanted to look at it is, okay, write it down. What are you trying to validate against? Having the test plans, having the traceability to say, okay, I did this on this day, and if I wanted to go back, here is how I could traverse back to, as well as how do you keep the documentation, right? Every time you did something, you wanted to make sure that it is properly recorded in your systems. If it is not recordable in a system, even in Notepad on your desk to write it down to say, this is how I tested and this is the conditions that I have used to do the testing. So these are some of the important things, especially as you go into regulatory, because what you would be looking at it is not just like I validated, but showing the proof. And the way that we do at the place that I work at Simbex is like not only saying like you first have to state what you're going to do, like say what you're going to do what you said you're going to do, and show that you have done that. So those are the three things. If you translate that into more documenting in your QMS systems or however you're going to use, that would be the key to not only approaching the validation, but also ensuring that the right validation is done, and then showing to whoever, may it be clinical research, may it be FDA, or some other places where you got to go, you can show that as a proof.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you're saying. It's like there's the automation test that you can do of the actual action, but then there's the evidence. So a big thing of what I work on in the governance engineering is on how we're gathering evidence and like logging everything, making sure it's discoverable at some point that you need to prove, as well as that you can, like, what's your like go back plan? Can you reproduce it? What does it look like to reproduce it? But when you first asked the question, I was like, how do you validate that it actually works the way you thought it should work? Because there's also there's like the evidence, but like proving it to yourself that you worked. So when you were, say, you had an experiment, like what was your KPIs or your outcome that you were expecting, and that you were testing against that. And I think I liked how you were talking about, like, at least write it down somewhere in a piece of paper. Like, that's like the bare minimum. But hopefully you're doing more and more advanced documentation as you go along to prove that you're doing this. And then you can prove to other people for a long time, like years and years, you need to maintain these kinds of evidence and logs. So even if you are a startup, that's something I think people don't always think about, but you need to have a way that your evidence is going to be immutable and around for a long time.
I'll add to these. Completely agree with each of these points. The way I think about validation is going back to how I define what I mean. I believe validation of kind of can fall in a couple buckets. One, you're validating that the way that you understood the data is real. And sometimes that happens by the way that you've developed the model itself. And so there's like a benchmarking component. Given ground truth data, sometimes you might have to generate, if you don't have those kinds of data to validate an innovative model. That goes into benchmarking, where you're trying to prove to yourself that what you built works in a contained setting where you know the assumptions. And then there's the question of now, how do I prove to the folks who I am building this for that they can trust it and that they can use it as it should have been designed? And those are really essential moments to then say, we missed something. I'm so glad I did this. I'm so glad I didn't actually understand this piece and you helped me see that gap. So again, it comes back to establishing trust, yes, in like these AI models that now we are subsumed with, but also establishing trust between you, the researcher, and the end user. And so that back and forth is almost more essential than whether or not the model works, because you can solve that if you have trust between you and the user you're building it for. And then there's the continuous monitoring that I believe is really essential, particularly if you're designing something that you're going to hand off to someone else for them to use in their day-to-day, because we know that there's going to be there are going to be strengthened models. GPT-5 just came out. We're going to see these kinds of methods continuing to improve, and these problems of trust, these problems of understanding our data, and then how to choose the right problems are going to persist. I would argue that those are going to be evergreen problems in this space as AI continues to develop.
Yeah, because it's like not one time. Like you have data, you're probably not going to do it one time. You're going to have pipelines of data. You're going to have models that change over time. You're going to test out different models, and you need to establish those benchmarks. And because I come from the software side, and then you probably want a tool that will help you measure them over time. And like, what's the bias? What's the outputs? It's the data you're coming in. It's what's expected. Like you can run statistics on that data over time and see how it changes. And you can have alerts and escalations if it's not doing what it's supposed to do before. So that the one-time work is like just one time is kind of just the bare minimum at the beginning. You have to have this whole ecosystem of what's going to change over time, because you're also going to have to show that as evidence.
And to both of your points, the trail of steps that you've gone through, not only what the model goes through to gather evidence, let's say, but also the steps that you've gone through should be well documented, and that means like have an executive summary document that you can ship to people who might be interested in the project. Write down your milestones, have check-in points, have these little wins along the way so that you can go back and say, ooh, that was an assumption that we didn't write down. We can fix that.
I love how all of you have mentioned trust, and I just want to highlight a little bit from an early stage startup perspective where you don't have sort of that credibility or have worked with larger organizations. So I think what we are doing right now is actually designing with these organizations where you might have to put in more resources, more time than you would typically do, and it takes a lot more time than it would typically do, and especially for a healthcare perspective. But working with them and answering their questions related to trust, we're kind of assuring them that we still do have the systems that larger companies would have, and we do follow the protocols. I think that is where a lot of this input goes in. It's like you kind of have to make sure that the trust is built from day one.
And in terms of like talking about this in a startup space, I think startups in spaces that are in regulated environments or have a high risk, like they're going to have human health at risk, you have to do a lot more of this investment at an early stage startup than you do to other kinds of startup where that risk isn't there. And I think that makes startups in this space hard, because you do need to have a lot more stuff like a bigger company has at the beginning than other kinds of industries you don't always need.
And also how Pradeep was mentioning about promise. So a lot of times we have to under-promise so that we are not breaking the trust. Where typically in the startup space, you're kind of always highlighting your data in a very positive way. But here we have to be really cautious and under-promise so that we do meet all the milestones and all the requirements.
Excellent responses. AI and model governance. What guardrails do you put in place when using these different models in biology to ensure trust, explanatory, and regulatory readiness? First question is, do you have any guardrails? Second question is, what are they or how do you use them? Hopefully the first answer is yes.
For us, we do have human doctors in loop where a lot of the recommendations are validated by them and then sent off to the end user. We are also training the model, and the models are really good this day. So a lot of training has been done to ensure that the patient is protected, both their data as well as all the vulnerable stuff that happens, all the communication that is happening, it's protected. So that is what we are doing at our end from a consumer app perspective.
Just going down the line. Pretty.
Oh, yeah. And AI and guardrails, absolutely, it is needed and it's a must. And it is a bigger conversation across the companies, the tech companies especially, who are writing these models are dealing with. And I may not relate to them in that bigger scale, but at a smaller scale where we work with the smaller problems, there is absolutely, the main thing is, especially in the clinical decisions that we would be making through these models, how do we make sure that the decisions that came out of it has been validated in a way that through a science or through clinician expertise, there is some kind of guardrails that are used. Maybe there are a few frameworks that you could use to ensure that it is properly validated through that. So you can use, I could not remember exactly the framework that I have used previously, but there are frameworks that you could use to ensure that there are certain guidelines that are used. What are these guidelines or guardrails that you're trying to apply? Essentially, no infiltrated or no decisions that are made that are outside of clinicians' expertise. That is the main thing that we're talking about. So there are ways you could do that, and it is absolutely needed from my perspective.
Yeah, I think my answer is going to be, I think, pretty different because right now I'm at a very big company, and yes, there are many, many guardrails. There's like tons of people who this is their only job, where they work on the AI ethics at GSK, and we have teams, and we have training, and we have tons of documents about it. And where it comes down to my role is how are we going to scale that? We use a tool called OPA, Open Policy Agent, which is available to anybody, open source, and that we do policy as code and then scale that. But you have to have like the human language version first. So to scale that down to a startup, like you should at least write down what I think I need my AI governance to be. You're talking about those existing frameworks, and then at a minimum track them by human manually, and then figure out how you can track them with some kind of tool so you can scale over time. But I think, as we said, yes, obviously it's very important.
Yeah, it's essential. I wouldn't use any tool that didn't have guardrails. I don't think any of you should. I think we all agree. I see heads nodding. So it's common sense. How you implement it isn't always. And the tricky thing is, like in mathematics, we try and understand like what this latent space looks like that's hidden, and like what boundaries look like, and what's the shape of the distribution, right? Like it's just a sort of challenging space because it's somewhat hidden. So when we talk about like OPA, for example, and like just like having it written in like human readable language is a first step. I think that there's a through line to effectively writing your assumptions. So it goes back to that. It goes back to trust. And with trust, you start to define, okay, what would you do in this case? Oh, well, what if the answer was this? What would you do here? And you're talking to the end user. You're trying to understand more about their problem. And when you come up to, I don't know, this is where I think AI models could be helpful. They might propose papers you haven't considered. But now the task is not go find the paper, it is check. So any of you who've looked at like complexity theory will say, that makes sense, it's going to take you less time to check something than to go find something. So we can rely on these nice principles and add that humanistic component to say, let's devise these guardrails for what we do know, but again, building in assumptions to make sure that we at least flag with proper error messages and unit testing in your code when we don't know something.
One more thing to add is even now, if you see our publicly available models, especially let's take ChatGPT 5, you can ask, how did you come to this conclusion? And it gives you a reasoning. This is what we would be facing with in the future, especially in the closing models, is to say somewhere it has to give an explanation on how it arrived to the decision it made, what path it took. So that's the key thing behind the scenes, the observability that you would put in as a framework behind the scenes to see how is this working, how are your team that is monitoring or observing this would have a lot more insight, but those are all going to come into more public because of the concerns around like, is it going to behave on its own, or is it going to stick to what we had asked it to do, especially if it is self-learning?
I'll add one more thing that I forgot to mention. In a lot of applications, you're going to not just straight up use GPT-5. You're going to build it into some program that you've generated. And so if there are parts of that tool that you are building where you can say, we have a resource to check that this nomenclature is correct, you should be incorporating that. You should be integrating that and adding that to your trail to generate, to ensure that you have those guardrails in place.
It's maybe to get slightly too specific, we've been talking about like data and models, but there's also metadata about your data and metadata about your models. And that's where, when you are starting out, you can try to do it right the first time, like enforce what's the right metadata you want, so that you can do guardrails. Like you can do guardrails in the future. Like when did it come in? What's its retention rate? Like the description of what it's supposed to do. Those are all things you actually will need to scale if you ever want to automate. So it's easier to start at the beginning with the right data than to try to retrofit it over time.
Awesome. Love it. So going into more alignment with people between these models and timelines, how do you align, given that this is very, very cross-disciplinary, between scientists, engineers, product teams, and possibly C-suite, depending on how big your company is? How do you align all of that when you're building software with data and biology? Not a small question.
I think it's easier for smaller teams. But I think the key thing here is not everybody is at the same literacy level when it comes to AI. So a lot of the language that we use have to be, such that everybody understands. So we talk with a lot of physicians, and some of the questions are, what is this UI thing that you're talking of? So being really able to explain it in a way that they understand, so that we get their perspective and get their relevant insights. So using a common language that everyone understands would be something to get everyone's buy-in and to get everyone's insight.
Based on in what context you're looking at, when you wanted to align, right, are we talking about building a product that is across the different team members, different diverse expertise, including the management, is aligned? If we think from that perspective, then you got to have some kind of structural approach to this, right? That structural approach could be as simple as having a business idea, and then from there having a plans to how to implement it, and then breaking it down to by when, what, roadmaps and execution plans. These are all the way that you could think about if we are talking about having alignment. But if it is not just building a product, but coming up to a solution in software, why do we have to go in a path A versus path B? Then comes in alignment across ideas, right? Then you got to have some sort of brainstorming, some sort of decision matrix that you would build in to say, what is the weightage we wanted to give? Would we do it in this way versus the other way? So there are ways you could do, there are frameworks you could use, and then at the end of the day, it all comes down to who is running the ship, right? Whoever is in charge of it would have an idea on how to approach this to to this problem. And then bringing the alignment in there. Those are the two things that I wanted to share. I'm sure there are other things that.
In some ways, it's like how you run any project, like software project. You got to bring people together and have your goals and requirements. But I think one thing that is unique about this space that you guys both talked about is not everyone's coming from the same space. So to try to figure out how to get to a common alignment, at least on where we're at and what's possible. And if it's a small company, it might be easier because it's just like, you and like 3 people, and then you sit and you learn and read stuff together. And at GSK, being a very large company, there's just tons of training that they're rolling out and lots of organizations to try to get the company all like up leveled at the same time across these new technologies. And we do cross-functional teams, that those 4 groups that you just named, like we have working groups for the different kind of problems we're solving that bring those teams together so that we can align on our objectives. But part of it as well is just people coming to a common understanding of what's going on in the industry and what's available.
I'll add to these maybe 2 things. So when you are trying to align with leadership, collaborators, that's, I guess, making the assumption that you've chosen the right problem. So if you have chosen the right problem, you should be able to draft what I like to call an executive summary. A summary of what you're going to be trying to accomplish on what time frame. If it's successful, how the world would be different. And then give a nod to why this collaboration, why this set of people. And if you can convince yourself of that, then the next question becomes, okay, if I sent this over to my collaborators, what would they say? Would they agree? Would they add? Would they remove? And in that way, you're also just sort of developing an elevator pitch that you could take to leadership, but you can also refine and say, ooh, our problems should be different. Oh, that impact isn't as high as I would want, right? Like you can start to think about a joint framework that allows for that alignment. And so at least in my work, I've appreciated writing these short, sometimes just a paragraph, executive summaries that stand on their own and can be legible and understood by anyone who reads them, because indeed, all parties have their own expertise, and so you're entering at different levels, but that should be at least clear.
I think that's a good point. Like these working groups are what we're talking about. Like problems are sometimes where even we start. Like, do we all agree on the problem? Okay, we don't. Let's figure out how to agree on the problem. Like talk through that. And that makes it easier over time if you've aligned on that. It's not always starting from like execute on this plan. It's like, let's figure out if we're actually working in the right problem.
And writing it down.
Yes,
like that's
right,
why I
writing
think
it down.
like it's not real if it's not written, as a rule of thumb. And then we have these joint steering committee meetings where every so often we all get together in a big group and we say, okay, what are we going to do for year 5 or year 1 or month 3? And that kind of sort of alignment can happen at that level too. And again, things are written, and so you can go back and say, did we accomplish that? Did we accomplish this? And in so doing, you've formulated milestones that you can hold each other accountable for or modify as needed based on achieving that set goal that you've put down and can point to in your executive summary.
Another piece to add to that, it may be executive summary or in a different setting. Reviews are the right ways to realign. Because things change as you're progressing in developing these products are exploring a solution to a problem. Assumptions change, things change, and you hit a wall and then you take a turn. All of these could be handled through not only writing, but also having some sort of review meetings that would allow to say, all right, here is where we are, and we thought we wanted to go this path, we had done this, but no, that's not the realistic, we're going to take it down here. So that's always helpful for in the projects that I had worked.
Thank you. So going back to the team question, I guess all alluded to. So how do you build a new team today, whether it's hiring externally or trying to find the right team internally? So when you're dealing with biology and software, what is a non-negotiable in terms of who has to be on that team, but who might be helpful, but necessarily part or adjacent to your team? Because that's super critical. If anybody understands how this stuff gets done, who you have on the table is going to make or break it. Just go from the line.
Okay.
Yeah. Step in.
I'll start with Ashley. That's whom I wanted to hire. Because she has the research and also some sort of biological education. So experience. So to me, that's the key thing. People who could go into both functional as well as technical. If you could find that kind of combination in one person, that's a gift, in my view. So that's why it is always important to start with the right team that has a mix of it, and especially the person who is going to be leading that has that balance, can understand technical, can speak, but also have the drive on the functionality side. This is where we're going to go. To me, it may be a product owner or a product manager. That's where it starts. All things would start, and after that, a good technical pairing would make it a lot easier.
I think a lot of it goes down to like how many people you can hire. Like, but I would see if you can only hire a few, you want a SME in the problem, a subject matter expert in the problem you're trying to solve. So at least have someone who's very familiar with the problem you're trying to solve. Because you, especially on the software side, you can contract out to those roles, especially if you're trying to look more generic. But like you're saying, it's ideal if you get someone who knows both, but those are very hard to find, and they probably can really demand a premium on those skills. So it's a subject matter expert, the problem you're trying to solve. And then I hear a lot of people, they always want machine learning scientists or data scientists, but you also want people who understand how to build this foundation and infrastructure that we've been talking about, like with the data and the models and the cleaning, because that's a big part of what you do. And there are like data scientists and machine learning scientists who can do both. So if you only can hire one person, you're really looking for someone who can do both of those kinds of skills.
And also, I mean, hiring, if you're not able to hire, there are also a lot of organizations that does it for you. So there's always, having contractors or just outsourcing that piece of work if you don't want to do full-time hiring.
I didn't sign up for this question, but I will add, one of the things that I have found really powerful on the teams that I get to be a part of and work with, at Microsoft at least, and we talk about this a lot internally, we want people who have a growth mindset. So if you've not heard of this term, you might laugh at it, but it is essential to the work that we do. There are people in this room, on this panel, who have diverse sets of expertise. No one can be an expert in all of the things that are required for the problems that we've discussed today. But if you know how to think, if you know how to learn, and if you can give yourself a moment to pick up a new skill, that is the kind of thing that we have found to be a huge asset.
We'll open this up for Q&A. There's somebody with a microphone in the back, and raise your hand if you have any questions for the panel.
Hello, Tom Maglione. Thank you for coming. I do real-time embedded systems, so if you're looking for some of that expertise, I can help you. Really, I'd like to address this to Piali and Pradeep. Piali, when you mentioned earlier about doing a glucose monitoring, I'm assuming you're using like a wearable for that?
Not at the moment. So right now it's manual logging where they can use our app to track in their data. So about 90% of the pregnant women, they use like a glucometer. So considering that, we have manual logging, and then in future we'll integrate a continuous glucose monitor.
So I'd like to introduce you to Pradeep, sitting next to you,
Yeah.
because he works for Simbex, and they make wearable technologies. This could be very helpful for you. Just remember that I hooked you up. Thank you.
Hi. One thing that I play around with Meta is that I ask it, what is the cure to cancer for all cancers all week? And it just says, well, the answer is cancers are all different, so it changes. So then what I get it to do is I have it hallucinate and try to come up with different creative solutions where I come into a science fiction type of world and science fiction simulation where then I can create characters. So have you created simulated employees that can kind of do both things, both the creative and the technical. One thing that I did is I used the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles because they have, from the Renaissance era. So getting those personas from AI can really expand the science fiction type of area. What are your thoughts on doing that? And then if everything's regulated, like that's kind of, things can go out of bounds pretty quickly. But it is very entertaining, at least to do on the weekends.
I can start with that. So, at least for us, we have created an AI persona that answers all pregnancy-related questions. And the way we wanted to, we wanted this particular persona to mimic a community health worker. So, community health workers work in rural areas. They are mostly retired nurses. They have a very kind persona, very patient. They seem to have a lot of time in that sense, listening to user questions and answering them. So we are working directly with the health system who have these network of community health workers, and we are training this AI chatbot with the kind of language they use, the kind of reassuring words they use. So it's kind of similar, not exactly, but that is what the goal is to incorporate more empathy and warmth into these responses, AI responses.
I'll add from a modeling standpoint that we think about agentic modeling as being very interesting to us in today's world of machine learning and building these AI models. So for those who are not familiar with agentic systems, imagine that you took a task and you split it up into what an expert might do in one category and another expert in this other category, and you have an orchestrator, someone who is going to be that bridge between these different agents. And so that agentic framework enables you to have a system like what you're describing, because in the end, you might be the orchestrator saying, ooh, Michelangelo gave me this information, and someone else, maybe one of the evil
That's exactly
people.
what I did. I had Michelangelo write quantum computer code, and Leonardo was like the art director, and then Donatello was the scientist. So you could get those personas to come up with this simulation on, well, for me, it was how to cure cancer, but all cancers. So an impossible question at this point, but I think if you create enough agents and kind of have the right orchestrator with subject matter expertise, that could happen. Just having the right person ask the right questions.
Or having an orchestrator who is able to do that every day, like you're saying. You were the one doing this on the weekends. Have one pop up on the weekends and do that, and then summarize it for you. So you start to see how this can layer out.
Hi, Christoph Gensler from Sondel. I have a question more about the idea of how a startup should prepare for long-term preservation of data, and how, ultimately you would like to, some people would like to be acquired in 2 years, and how do I do that? How do I prepare for that so that I can what are the main points? What would you think that there are some things that you absolutely would say this is something everybody should do from day one?
I think from my perspective, from day one, use all HIPAA certified sources. So like AWS, Google Cloud, all the servers. They're pretty much covered all the basic regulations. So instead of storing locally, use those. So that is kind of like the most basic thing that we can do. And a lot of these companies are also very helpful for startups. So they have credits, they have their engineers who would work with you, actually teach you how to use these products. So that would be, I think, I would start with that. And then obviously, as you get more funding and all of that, you can obviously do all these audits and get HIPAA certified and all of that. But that is what will happen in the future, because all of these requires resources.
I think like save all your decisions, save all your Like if you have data, save your model and make sure it's saved in the cloud in a secure environment. So like, don't put it in your personal Google Drive. Like you want to have it somewhere that it's going to be secure, because that's what I think they'll look at, like people who audit, just assume it's going to be like an auditor. Those are the things they're going to look like: encryption, security. Are you controlling who's accessing it? Do you know who's accessing it? Like those are the things they want to know in terms of what you're saving.
And also have backups.
Turn that configuration on in your secure drive.
I'll add to that too, that if you are working with patients or with community groups, telling them about this process and saying like, you know, this is one way that we establish trust. I am telling you exactly what procedure we are doing and following to ensure that your data is protected. That goes a long way as we start to think about designing an architecture that establishes trust. Because if you establish trust, not only do you have an asset for the startup, but that as a concept can be shared to your friends, other startups, other organizations when you think about working with other community groups.
Hi, my name is Simon. I'm founder of iEmbrace, and we are combining like AI with meditation to incorporating mindfulness into people's daily life. And we are right now having a conversation with a lot of schools, therapists. And the first question they always ask is that, is your product like following like HIPAA compliance? And as an early age startup, I'm trying to ask like, how do you navigate through like the user compliance, user regulation, and user privacy, and especially in the field of biotech? I think this is like the most headache problems for early stage startup, because you have limited budgets and you have limited resources, and I just curious, how do you guys navigate through it?
So if you go to HIPAA compliance, there is like, I think, few, I don't remember the exact number, but few guidelines. So first is the servers, which is the most important thing, is everything that you're using is HIPAA compliant, HIPAA certified. So tomorrow when you do get audit, you don't have to, face a huge barrier, like you have to change your entire tech stack or your entire infrastructure. So I think that's the first thing. Second is, so this is what happened with us. We were in conversation with the health system, and they do understand that all of these audits, they take a lot of resources. So from early conversation to actually getting a contract, there is usually a timeline of 6 months or more. So if you do get even like an LOI or something from that, so that is like a good time to start the audit process. But again, like if you're already doing things that are within this HIPAA compliance rules, you are not going to face a lot of challenges when it comes to the actual audit.
Hello, hi, Todd Benjamin. My co-founder and I are at the intersection of life science and technology. So I think my question is probably best addressed to Jane and to Ashley. My question is, how are you dealing with fair data? Data that is findable, actionable, interoperable, and reusable. I mean, GSK has got to have tons of legacy data, and you can't really validate that data. So my question really addresses data validation. So how are you cleaning up the old data, and how are you making the new data clean so that you can have that validation and so that it can become fair data?
We're spending a lot of time working on it. So, I mean, that's a huge, huge thing of what we're trying to do with the data assets that we have internally at GSK, that they are reusable. And how we're doing that, but for both new data and old data, is really around this metadata that I talked about. So there's teams of people that work on like, what's the set of metadata that we want to apply? How do we do it to everything incoming that's new? And that's this thing I'm talking about. We have a policy engine with this open policy agent. Like we write policy as code to ensure that it comes in that way. And then we actually have teams of people working on the retrofit, like to go back over time to be able to tag data. We also have what we call the data harmonization team that's looking at scientific tags that would go on this data, and then how we use there's tools available that you can use that are metadata, like storage and manipulation interfaces, so we work with those, but it is very time consuming because, there's a lot of data at GSK. So my advice is if you're starting from the beginning, do it right from the first time. Like with the metadata that's tagged, use services. There's open source for some of this kind of stuff for metadata. And so that's there from the beginning, so you're not having to go back in time to retrofit it. But any big company, this didn't necessarily exist a couple years ago, so they're all going to try to retrofit it. But there are tools available, and there's also things like models. We're using machine learning and regression on some of this to tag based on what we've known in the past. So we're not all just doing it by hand. So trying to use a mix of tools and humans in the loop, and then computational tools to save it over time.
I don't have much to add. This is also the case at Microsoft, but we also have partners who ask us these questions, or we have partners who give us data to look at, and we do that in their tenant and things, and they own it. But we give suggestions based on the learnings from internal for the data that we do have internally to say, maybe you could structure your data in this way and things like that. So on top of what Jane's saying, I would say there's also just we spend a lot of time suggesting ways that our partners can also implement similar practices.
And I think the big thing that I think about is how do we do it faster? Like how can we automate it? How can we do it faster? Yeah. But how can we still have the right controls and the right amount of humans in the loop? And it is a big task.
And how do we essentially have the validation piece that we did it right? How do we benchmark that we did it correctly?
Thank you. So I have a question for Jane and Ashley. In the past, probably 4 or 6 months, OpenAI, Anthropic, any big AI lab is putting up a group saying AI for science, basically capitalizing on the idea of Future House, basically building agentic systems for scientific discovery. Just yesterday, Lilly pushed an initiative called a Tune Lab, which is basically opening access to drug discovery for AI systems. And I guess my question to you is what GSK and Microsoft are doing in that environment, and what do you guys think these initiatives will democratize or will be useful to democratize scientific discovery?
I don't know much about the overall GSK business strategy in this space, so that's probably questions for other people. But to go back, what's really important behind those models is the data that you're using. So different companies have different sets of proprietary data. So I'm curious to know what kind of data they're using to train that and make that available, because that's where I see in that space, whoever has either the best data or the good data, that's who's going to win in those kind of models for what people are using for purpose.
Yeah, and I'll add to that when you're working with any partner, they are going to have their set of data, and they're going to be able to say, yeah, we'll build something together. And then you work with another partner, and their problem's going to be a little different, and the data's going to look a little different. And you certainly can't necessarily say, hey, let's have company A and company B and company C deal with this together. So you really have to be careful to, going back to all the things we've been talking about on this panel, think about how to solve the right problem. And a lot of times it ends up being that, this concept of AI for science is that it's a concept. And so when we think about curing cancer, they're all going to look a little different. You probably ate something different than you today, right? All of these things need to be taken into account. And so these missions are amazing. But in the end, we are companies that work with other companies and try and solve problems. So there's a question of how we think about aggregating this knowledge that we are acquiring through these individual partnerships collectively. And I'm really excited for that kind of problem to be solved. And I don't know how to solve that part.
Okay. I want to give a huge thank you to our speakers here. We have a lot more in store for both today and, of course, the rest of the week. At 6:30 p.m. on the first floor, we have the Ecosystem Fair that is showcasing over 20 resources in the startup community, including government organizations, accelerators, and networking groups. Again, right here on this building. The next session is Engineering with Guardrails, starting at 4 p.m. If you're interested in that, of course, you can stay in this room. But otherwise, I hope you all guys have rest of wonderful day here, Boston week, or if you're leaving, rest of the week as well. If you are joining us virtually, you don't need to go anywhere. Just please check your schedule, close it, open up again. Otherwise, you can check out our community board on the first floor to post opportunities or see what's happening across the startup scene. And I hope you, again, hope you all have a wonderful rest of Startup Boston.
Both of them.